Hello, my name is Joyce, and today I'll be presenting my oral presentation on an article produced by the Washington Post. This article was titled, "The Pandemic Caused a Surge in Domestic Violence, Leaving Victims with a Few Options and Abuse Became the New Normal." My article today resides in Amman, Jordan, with a woman named Umside. Umside is a mother of 3. She's a full-time caregiver, and for part-time she works with young children. Behind Umside's busy schedule and COVID-19, Umside was facing an additional pandemic. This additional pandemic was titled the Shadow Pandemic. The Shadow Pandemic was domestic violence Umside was personally facing behind closed doors. Umside's family was personally affected by COVID-19 with the loss of her husband's job. With the loss of his job, this brought on many financial struggles and stressors for her family. And as the stressors began to grow, so did the domestic violence that was being inflicted upon Umside. When Umside was questioned about the domestic violence she had been facing, she was quoted as saying, "It's better that I carry this burden myself rather than burden my whole family." In the Jordans, it's deemed a social disgrace for a woman to try to leave their family. So not only would the social disgrace make it potentially difficult for Umside to leave this relationship, she also had personal concerns about not being able to take her children with her, or the loss of her children if she tried to escape this relationship. A survey conducted by the UN for Gender Equality found that 7 in 10 women have reported seeing increases in domestic violence in their country since the pandemic began, and 1 in 4 women stated that they felt less safe since the pandemic began. Hearing even just the word COVID-19, we as an audience can probably all think of a way we've personally been affected by COVID-19. Whether it was moving completely online for school for the first time, moving remotely online with a job, the loss of a job like Umside's husband, or potentially, even unfortunately, the loss of a loved one. Despite the many stressors COVID-19 has brought onto individuals and communities and may continue to bring, if there's any light to be shed to the situation, it's that it's forced both the United States legislation and legislation across other countries to look at how they're going to handle domestic violence in light of the pandemic. And this Jordan specifically, where Umside lives, they were completely underprepared to deal with the rises of cases and domestic violence during COVID-19. The Jordans attempted to respond to the rise of cases during the pandemic by implementing special police units and women's organizations. These 2 implementations were found to be ineffective, however, because when they were implemented, the amount of cases they were receiving went far beyond what they could have expected. And because there was more cases than they could have anticipated, many victims were turned away. So whatever hope could have been given to them, it was surely taken away because so many of them were turned away. The most recent survey by the UN for Women found that 65% of women and victims were told to seek assistance from family members. 6% were told to seek assistance from police units, and at the lowest rate was 5% were told to seek assistance from women's organizations. 65% is a significant amount of people who are told to seek assistance from family members. Unfortunately, victims may not have the privilege of having a strong relationship with their family members, or they might feel that opening up about their abuse would be respond with disbelief. Feeling that there might be disbelief about opening up the abuse could be in a situation if the perpetrator was one of the family, such as a brother, a sister, a cousin, a father, dad, or various other family members. Other resources that were implemented during this time where things such as Facebook messages, WhatsApp messages, and other various forms of social media outreach to try to reach these women and victims during this time, but these were found to be ineffective. My personal insight on the matter when reading this article is that I appreciated that at least something was being done in regards to the pandemic and the rise of cases. However, despite them being ineffective, maybe they could reevaluate what parts of it were ineffective or just try different options to deal with the amount of cases. As I continued to read the article, however, I was informed that in the Jordans, they still apply something called the settlement process. For those who aren't aware what the settlement process is, the settlement process allows the person who is being tried for court to no longer have to show up to court if they pledge to not hurt the victim again. This specific example reminded me of Chapter 2 in our textbook, History of Violence in the Family. Referencing that chapter, this reminded me of the way women were supposed to deal with violent husbands underneath the Common English Law. Underneath the Common English Law, women were told to provide an informal testimony and report their husbands to the breach of peace. And once that was done, the husband was told to pledge a bond for his good behavior. Looking at the similarities in these two examples, despite the many years of history between them, it made me think, if the word of mouth was not good enough to protect victims back then, why do we think it'd be good enough to protect them now? So in the Jordans and other countries that may have this strong patriarchal attitude towards women and victims, essentially the things such as the implementing specialized police units, women's organizations, and the social media outreaches I mentioned earlier, in my opinion, those are going to be ineffective in the long run because the core issue is not being dealt with. If there's laws in place, but at the end of the day, these victims are being turned away because these issues are not a big enough problem for them to deal with, or it's not severe enough for them to seek assistance for these victims unless it potentially leads to death. Are we telling victims that truly facing domestic violence head on and creating an end to it is not important enough for them? Looking back at even in the 1960s, spousal abuse was still considered a private matter even. And at best, it was considered a misdemeanor, and that's only if the police saw it in public view. So for me personally, I found it disheartening as I was reading this article and being informed about what was going on in the Jordan specifically, because despite all this time, much of the same patriarchal attitudes are being held toward these victims. Moving forward and attempting to lessen these patriarchal attitudes and changing the legislation within the countries like the Jordans, the way I think this could realistically be done is implementing community defenders into countries like the Jordans and various other countries that may be struggling with understanding the dynamics of domestic abuse, the resources these victims need, and just creating policy change in general within these communities. The reason why I think this would be effective in changing the patriarchal attitudes in these communities, along with lessening the cases of domestic abuse, is because community defenders are not only taught on the dynamics of domestic abuse, they work with victims themselves. They teach others on the dynamics of domestic abuse, and then they also work on creating policy change. Not only would community defenders make a large impact in communities because they're teaching others about domestic violence and what that looks like and trying to prevent it, they're also getting that unique perspective of the victim. As a future human service worker, I can probably guarantee that there's going to be a scenario where I won't have a textbook definition about what to do, or there won't already be a law in place that gives a clear, defining answer of how to go about situation. And COVID-19 specifically, and seeing how this affected Umzaid and others in her country during this time, is a great example of being forced to look at the legislation that's already in place and seeing that's ineffective. Prior to COVID-19, there might not have been a scenario that would have forced United States legislation and legislation across the world to no longer sweep these problems underneath the rug, but truly deal with them and bring a light to what's happening. By getting the unique perspective of victims, future human service workers, law enforcement workers, and various other jobs that would be working with potential victims of domestic abuse can be informed on what these victims need throughout the process of healing from domestic violence. What resources they did not receive during the time of the pandemic, and even what resources they wish they could have received. Obviously, none of us could have predicted COVID-19, but there might be future pandemics, or there might be continuous lockdowns, and we can't continue to keep implementing the same resources and outreach programs that are essentially deemed ineffective for dealing with domestic violence. Moving forward in the world in regard to domestic violence in general, it needs to be understood that domestic violence is not simply a socioeconomic issue. It's not just a third world country problem. It's not only an issue in the Jordans, with Umzaid, who I've been speaking about throughout this presentation, and their lack of resources. Domestic violence and bringing change to it is a world problem. Domestic violence can affect people such as our neighbors. It could be our family members, our siblings, and we may never know about it. That's why it's so important to know the signs, the symptoms of it, and also just bring forth policy change in regards to domestic violence. The focus moving forward should be how to end domestic violence and not really how to silence the many cries we hear from it. Thank you.